Thank you very much for coming today for this seminar. So we'll have two presentations. The first one is called Impact Case Study Update, Improving Understanding of Skill Acquisition in Performance Preparation in Elite Coaching, and will be delivered by Professor Keith Davids, Joe Stone, and Ben Strafford. So it will be a joint presentation, and then we'll continue with the second presentation from Elysa.
Thank you, Russ. Good to see everyone. So what we're going to do today is talk about our impact case study. This is the third version of the case study, and we're preparing this for, obviously, for the next rep. And for those of you who don't know, I'll start off by just introducing what our skill acquisition research team is interested in, where it originated, the ideas, and then I'll hand over to Joe to start talking about the impact case study. And then eventually Ben will talk about the impact on team members that we also try to sustain in the methods that we use for our research, joint research. So a bit of a background, for those who don't know, we work in the theory of ecological dynamics, which is not one of the mainstream dominant theories, although it's getting quite popular. This is where it came from. It started off in a paper in 1994, where we questioned the main approach to studying skill acquisition, which came from psychology and human science. And it was based on cognitive psychology, so very much locked up in what the mind and the brain was doing to control movements. And the position we advocated was that actually that only tells you part of the story, and it's a bit of a misconception. What's really important is the person-environment relationship, because essentially what happens is people think that the environment is recreated in the model of the world inside the brain, but it's not. You're directly interacting with it all the time. So this paper here just raised a question that said, have we got it wrong in psychology and human science? And it's really skill acquisition focused on that person-environment relationship. These other examples here show you that these ideas and principles and concepts of the theory are not just applied to elite sport, although we're going to talk about elite sports performance and coaching and coach development today as an example, but actually it applies to things like green exercise, engaging with the outdoors, in using ecological dynamics principles in outdoor sports, work with children, even very young children, learning to ride a bike. And by the way, those of you listening who've got young children learning to ride a bike, this is another program of work that I've essentially showing that the balance bike is better preparation for learning to cycle compared to a bike with the rollers on the side. And then of course there's work with elite athletes as well. And this one here, Jack Bale, he's a joint PhD student working at La Trobe University in Melbourne, and he is part funded by the Australian Defence Force. And his research is on how do you train shooters, military operators, to go in and clear out streets and rooms and houses in combat areas using the principles of ecological dynamics rather than a very static approach that they take at the moment. So the main point here is the skill acquisition research team works in rehabilitation, physical education, in education, coaching at all levels, from children to elite performers, military, contexts like the military and other performance contexts, and of course things that are important to parents as well. So in terms of rep impact, these are the main phases that our group, our themes research has gone through. We've got three different aspects of the impact that's important, and they actually correspond to the phases of the development that the skill acquisition research in the ecological work of ecological dynamics Scotland. The top part of the diagram, developing the ecological dynamics framework, this refers to the conceptual basis of ecological dynamics. That still goes on. That started in 1994 when people started to question, why should we be interested in this? What's wrong with the cognitive model? So that's very much about the conceptual basis of it, established from 1994 onwards, developed particularly in a paper in 2006 with Duarte Rougeau and colleagues in University of Lisbon. And then there's the idea that people then went, okay, so you've got these theoretical ideas and models, but what about the evidence? And that's an important part as well, to talk about the empirical evidence and data collection in lots of different contexts, as I've mentioned before, from school education to working with young infants to elite athletes and even in different performance contexts. And this is pretty much about the application phase, which came from a criticism of, okay, you've got evidence and studies and experiments, but what about the application? Does it work? And this actually is quite important for the development of impact in different contexts. So Joe, you're going to talk about this next aspect.
Thanks, Keith. And Keith will be back up again in a minute. But before we get on to the actual impact, we just wanted to highlight the impact on our own colleagues and our group as a whole. So we're a very open group, very happy to collaborate with anyone that's interested in our core areas of research. And by doing this, it helps all of us grow and develop as researchers in our careers. So we've obviously got people like Keith who are very, very experienced, published lots and lots of papers that we can learn from. And then people like me who are a bit more in the middle stage of our career, who have published, again, quite a number of papers through the help of Keith, but also our PhD students and our ECRs. And then we've got other people like Ben, who again has come through our undergrad course, our postgrad course, then did a PhD, we can get rid of him, and then managed to get himself a lecturing position here, and again is building his profile and going on to be known as an international researcher. And then other staff members like Tim, who were previously not necessarily overly active in research, who have got into research. He's just about to hopefully submit his PhD at the end of the summer. Once marking gets down, he can finish off the last few chapters. So we'll have another member of staff that was previously inactive necessarily in research, lots of great applied experience around physical education and coaching that are going to develop into the next sort of researchers from there. And then people like Sam and Andy. Andy's just finished his PhD, got a full-time position at Harriet-Watt University in Scotland, again doing lots of applied research in the coaching space. And Sam, who's one of our current PhD students in the GTA, who is also coming towards the end of his PhD and doing, again, a lot of work around some of the core areas we're getting to. The key bit, I've put a circle on here, we're not hierarchy. Keith is not, the boss at the top dictating to us all what we're doing. We very much work as a network and we all learn from each other, and that's the way we try and see our group, trying to bring in as many people as we can, and that helps us all achieve a lot of the areas from there. That links into our PhD students. So some of you may know I'm the postgrad research tutor in sport and physical activity, so I have a lot to do with PhD students in the department. And our group has a lot of PhD students, I think, for a fairly small body of staff. And we've just demonstrated here some of our students across the world. Some have completed or have recently completed, some are still active with us. So we've got our main hub here around the UK and Europe. We're missing a few people like James Banks, who joined us in the last 6 months. But we've got a core of students. Some of them are on scholarships, which is great, but we actually attract a lot of part-time self-funding students. So they're professional coaches, teachers, people that have full-time jobs but are really interested in our research. And they want to use their research in their own applied practice. So we attract quite a few self-funding part-time students. And that's important for impact because they're using their research in their practice. So there's already a direct link into, say, how Fabian, who works at Liverpool, and Keith will talk about shortly, is using some of our research in that elite environment. We also then have a widespread of students. So I saw Sirius is online with us. Sirius is up here based in mainland China. He's working with the Chinese National Rugby Sevens team and using his work with them to inform his PhD. So he's using our distance learning option. So we've met a lot with Sirius online, but we've not physically met him in person as yet. But again, it's a way that our group is utilising that distance learning PhD option. We then have other students like Keith mentioned in Australia, with Jack and a couple of other La Trobe Shoe students, again utilising that scheme the best we can. And then finally across the other side of the map here, people like David, who is a US national, came to Sheffield and studied with us for a number of years, but has gone back to the US now just to finish up his PhD. And Joe Miller similarly came from Canada to study with us, and his wife is very heavily pregnant. If Joe's online, she hasn't given birth yet, but literally in the next couple of days, so they've just moved back to Canada and towards the end of his PhD, again, for that family support. So we've got lots of PhD students all working on different projects, but underpinned by the theme of ecological dynamics at its core. And that allows us to have lots of impact with lots of reach, which I'll come onto shortly. If you don't know anything about impact case studies, and you don't know anything about REF, I just wanted to highlight this is how impact case studies were rated or evaluated last time round. So what we were looking to do is demonstrate both reach and significance. So to get a 4-star, which we're aiming for, what we're trying to go for, we needed to demonstrate outstanding impact in both reach and significance. There's different ways that reach and significance are defined via the REF sort of admin process, but ultimately we're looking for what's our reach in terms of worldwide, and then how significant is that impact on whatever reach that might be. We're assuming it'll be similar for the next round, but we don't know as yet. So to go on to the more interesting stuff, I guess, what have we been doing since 21 to lead us into REF 29? What impact have we been trying to develop? We've been sticking with our 3 main core areas or themes that we produced impact on last time. So elite performance success. This is a bit people really love to hear about, but I don't necessarily think it's the most important. I think the other 2 around transforming talent development programs and the work we do around education for coaches and PE teachers is probably more important socially rather than necessarily winning the Premier League. But these are the 3 key areas or themes of impact we are targeting. And on that, I'll be quiet for a second, just hand over to Keith, who's going to talk about Fabian's work at Liverpool.
Yeah, so Fabian Otte is not a PhD student at Sheffield Hallam with us. I got involved with his PhD at the University of Cologne towards the end of his PhD programme. He started off, he was a professional goalkeeper, got injured, got into coaching, working with children, started off coaching, went to New Zealand to coach, then got appointed to Burnley when they were in the Premier League. He was the assistant goalkeeper coach at Burnley. Before that he was working at Borussia Mönchengladbach in the German Bundesliga as an assistant coach. Finished up his PhD there, using ecological dynamics principles, and we'll see some of that in action in a minute. So in a sense, he's been almost like doing a second PhD without room attached to us while he's been in the UK. From Burnley, he was then appointed as the US national team, men's team goalkeeping coach, and then left that after about 18 months when Liverpool came knocking at his door, and has been a member of Arne Slot's team since last July. uses these principles, as I said. It's got a PhD, it's got a very good understanding of the science behind it as well. This is an example of some of the work done to present ideas on skill acquisition and what that means for training of elite, but particularly goalkeepers and footballers, and what that means for coaching. The Athletic magazine picked that up and then asked why Arnie Slott's coaching for some reason. He's not the goalkeeper coach. Arnie Slott's training. Wearing these goggles here is an example of Fabian using ecological ideas where the idea is to manipulate the information that goalkeepers are using when they're practicing to help them develop their perception, particularly focusing on their proprioceptive information by degrading visual information slightly.
It's a bit small.
Yeah, it's a bit small, but so this is the repetition without repetition. The idea of not just technical repetition. So what we've done is we've redefined what repetition means in skill acquisition. It's obviously important, but it's been conceptualized in the wrong way. Repetition without repetition means that what the goalkeeper does here, for example, is being coached, maybe in here, is that they repeat the solving of a movement problem. So this is representative of the game. Ball's in action all the time, the goalkeeper's being worked all the time, and they constantly have to adjust their position, take in information to adjust their position in terms of coordinating their actions. So there's one angle there using a different body part, you've got to address the performance environment in a different way and change their posture, regulate their position all the time using information that's present. And that's one example of
So this is another bit of work in elite football, and that I sort of fell into via a coach wanting a question answering. So during the COVID pandemic, all of the bad things that were linked to it, this project emerged. So you'll see this paper here with Adam Smith and Anthony Barry. So Adam at the time and Anthony were both working at Wigan Athletic Football Club. Anthony was the first team coach and Adam was the first team performance analyst. And Anthony was really interested in throw-ins. So he was doing his UEFA Pro coaching license, and as part of that you have to do like a mini dissertation. And he wanted to do it on throw-ins, but didn't know anything about research and didn't really know about how to go about trying to prove his hunch really of what he thought about throw-ins and the way he wanted to coach them. So he spoke with Adam, and me and Adam know each other from years and years back here at SHU. We did our master's degrees together like 15, 16 years ago now. So Adam came knocking on my door virtually and said, could we do something around throw-ins? And they had access to a data set from StatsBomb. So they're a leading data company. They provide data to pretty much all of the elite teams in the Premier League and the lower leagues. And they provide event by event data. They literally record every single thing you can think of in a football match. So 160 variables for every single metric. There's like millions of bits of data per match. And Adam and Anthony didn't know how to process it or get the findings they wanted from it. So they came to me and we did a research project. And that research project looked at throw-ins. No one had ever looked at throw-ins before. So the first thing I thought was, I'll go and check the literature and see what's actually been done. But no one had ever done anything about throw-ins before. So we investigated that. Anthony then presented the work at his UEFA Pro license. Frank Lampard was on the same course as him. Frank Lampard really liked it. So then Frank offered Anthony a job at Chelsea. So Anthony moved from Wigan to Chelsea. So the impact of the research really helped Anthony, alongside all of his other skill sets, move to Chelsea. When Frank Lampard got sacked and Tuchel came in as his replacement, Anthony stayed on, again, got on really well with him, then moved to Bayern Munich with him, and has now been appointed as his number 2 for England as their dead ball specialist. So it's just quite a nice story. All of the news articles say that Anthony watched all of the throw-ins, which is not true. All the data was collected by an external company, and then I processed all of the data. But hey ho, that's the sum for you to report that. But it's quite a nice direct link to show how the research here, and we've published a couple of papers since then, has led to a coach's career development. No, I'm not saying it's only our research that's led to that, but I think it was a helpful element, and it's been picked up by quite a few newspapers in the news, quoting our paper and linking us back to shoot. So just a nice example from a coach's question. If we're thinking about this idea of reach, this area is looking at how some of our research is being used in America, so in the NBA. So here, Alex, he's a UK-based basketball coach, but now has a job at Cleveland Cavaliers in the NBA. It's one of their leading sort of, I can't remember his official title, it is on there somewhere, Director of Player Development. Now, Alex is a basketball coach by background. He picked up on our ideas. He came to a few of our symposiums that we ran. He then wrote his own book, very coaching focused, applied book, but using our research to underpin his book. And he developed his own consulting company, Transforming Basketball. Again, economic impact from our research, demonstrating how you can build a business from it. He's then gone over to the US, and a number of teams now in the NBA are picking up on this idea of constraints-based coaching. And again, it's getting picked up in a number of different areas. That also led to Alex, and you'll hopefully remember David, who was on my PhD slide earlier, getting approached by Brown University. So they have the second largest athletics program in the US. And they were really interested in Alex's work, and then Alex invited David along to come and do some training really around constraints-based coaching and ecological dynamics. So we're demonstrating again how, through having this wide network, our research is then linking in to sort of Ivy League college-based sport in the US. And then finally, just around talent development pathways here, again, our work, this is taken from the last case study, this isn't necessarily new information, but we've got evidence, and we're building evidence of how our work is getting used in official talent development documentation, coaching guides, that sort of thing, to demonstrate how we're having an impact on those talent development programs. A really cool thing that me and Keith and Martin, who you may recognise, who was a former lecturer here at SHU, got invited to do, was to write the LMA, so the League Managers Association's first guide around something outside of sort of player care, so the idea around the skill acquisition guide. So me, Keith and Martin have written this guide. It takes some of the core principles of our research and distills it into coach-friendly language, so coaches can pick it up, read it, and try and apply some of the research ideas actually into their own coaching practice. And this is available to all professional league managers and coaches. And again, it's a way of just distilling our research to a very wide population of people and hopefully capturing their attention. Hand over to Keith, who's got a slide, and then I think Ben's up for the last little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, just to show that, again, it's the global reach. We were approached by Peter to explain these ideas because they were recognised as being important. And they have a research program where they invite people on, and we just gave the basics of ecological dynamics for their coaches across the globe. And from this, there have been a few connections abroad. One thing I did want to follow up with what Joe said about the PhD students. What we're noticing now, there's a trend of professionals who are in coaching already, working in coaching. They come across these ideas, they look at them and they think they like them a lot, they try to apply them, they have so much success, but they realise they need to know a lot more about it. So a lot of them are actually motivated enough to ask for some programs, research programs to go on. So this is where they come in and they self-fund. David Frokes is an extreme example, of self-funding as an international student. But we have a lot that want to come onto that remote PhD program, and they value that. So they can still work as a professional coach and then do their PhD part-time, and that's integrated with their professional work as well. And presentations like this will reach more of those. What we're also finding, and this might be interesting for people like yourself, Simon, is that we're getting requests where people don't necessarily want a professional qualification or an academic qualification. They want to know more about these ideas and become better at applying the ideas, and they need to understand the theory. And so they, after sort of short, brief courses, and so we're thinking about that, offering that next in terms of short courses for people who want to log on out there. We think there's a market out there for that.
Daniel, may I pay my account, please?
So one of the key things, however, is if you're interested in becoming research active or research,
I had a consultation with the doctor.
it's not just
the Edinburgh Clinic.
You can write blog posts, you can do a podcast, you can run a social media account, and build your contacts from that.
Would it help if I give the account number?
More often than not, they've seen members of our group in a podcast or a blog post, either straight to LinkedIn on LinkedIn, or all sorts of different avenues, and it is a real anchor to.
The account number is EC.
These are just some podcasts that we've been on.
177627.
Martin Drive.
177627.
That's an interesting website if you want to have a look at it. But
yes, this is Jill Rose Jacobs.
Is got animations, but I'll leave the animations off because it's like a full presentation. But what happened is these trees.
It sounds right to me.
So when you first start, actually, no, I'm going to put it on because it's easy to talk here. So the main thing is when you're in a group or you want to do a replication study, you want it to contribute to a image, right? To a picture, to a nice end product. I tried to find some sculptures made out of trees like that. So what we'll all hear is some outputs
7900
and then some at the end which were about the Delta method, which is what I was training for our group. So as you get started in your interest, you planted your tree, you planted it, it's sprouting and growing, the roots are getting deeper, and that will be opinion paper. So here, if you are not research active and you want to get research active, this is where like the staff-led and staff-directed projects, which we run through the independent project module, comes in. This is what it is meant to facilitate that initial interest and then growing your profile. Then as you go on, the tree starts to get larger as you start to publish work and grow a profile. And in the end, you're a big tree, and in the end you've got your niche and your trainings. That might be a particular method, it might be a particular mode of impact. It could be contributing to policy directives, for instance. This paper here, which you can't see, is a different area to mine. It's in social return on investment. I did with Elysa, who used to be a professor here, and some other colleagues, based on the Delta protocol, which is expertise developed in this tree trunk. So, you're developing a forest towards our food case. I was going to do a cake, but then I thought, oh my god, an 8-line cake. And then one other tip is to apply for internal funding pots. So this is some work we did for the Hallam Fund, and I'm carrying it on for the CCRI fellowship, which looks at how you can make a gamification program for Porco So kids get a booklet to fill out, it's like a magazine, and then they take that with them when they get back. There is some soundtracks that go along with it about him playing there. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening to our presentation, and if you've got any questions, our emails are there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Sorry I'm a bit late. It's amazing to hear about all the PhD studies all across the world. How do the students here get involved in undergraduate or MSc students? Are they involved in research in any way?
Yeah, so we've got the internal internship program.
Yeah.
So there's the funded one I'm actually about to recruit to for the football work at the minute. But me and Ben have also run undergrad and postgrad sort of research internships for the last 3 or 4 years, where students come on placement or get involved that way. Also, just through the project module. So, you know, Ben's a prime example really of how Ben came knocking on my door a long time ago with a project idea and was really keen and knew how to send automated emails at 6 a.m. in the morning to capture my attention. But like, really good project, again, with like Ben and Anna Fitzpatrick, people like that, who we worked really well on a project, got it published, then Ben came and did an MSc and PhD from that route. So yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities for students to get involved with them. It's often getting the students to want to come and be involved is the challenge I'm finding.
And the reforms we've made to the project module this year, really pushing staff-led and staff-directed projects. One of the main aim of that is to get research active, staff who aren't active in research, either applying for SRR or just engaging in research activities, which be interesting to see that develop.
Okay, so my understanding is that the main attraction of the project is the lead element, yes, in terms of reach and significance.
Yes, yeah. There's the idea of the reach being internal for at undergraduate level, as Simon said, and postgraduate level in one-off studies. The other is to excite students. They then typically you find with undergraduates and postgraduates that they focus it on a practical issue from their own sport, or if they're teaching or coaching. And a lot of the students who come through that, it's very rarely from a theoretical perspective that they're interested in, but then when they go on and do like at the master's level, the foundation undergrad level is like that as well. They realise the importance of the theory. If you remember that one of the first slides talked about the theory, the data collection, and then the application. You've got the importance of the theory feeding into the research studies, and then also the application as well. They learn that, and then by PhD level, they're fully integrated in the theoretical scientific concepts.
Thank you very much. The second presentation will be from Elysa Ioannou. It is open there. You can close the round.
Is there any questions online? How do I check?
I don't see it.
Oh, can you see? Was there any questions?
No.
Gonna have to stand kind of here because I used to do animations. So hi everyone, my name is Elysa. I'm a researcher here, but I'm going to present some work I did during my PhD. The QR code there I'll play at the end as well, but it's just so you can connect with me on Linktree, and I've got a list of the publications I'm going to talk about as well there, so you can access those links. But yeah, I'm going to talk about some PhD work that I did. My supervisors were Dr. Helen Humphreys, Dr. Catherine Homer, and Dr. Alison Purvis. So I'll shout out to them as a great supervisory team. I'm going to give a little layout on the background. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the methods, and I'll briefly kind of go through some of the main outputs and results from the thesis, but just as a disclaimer, what I'll present is like a big overview of my thesis work, so there's a few different publications within that, so it's not like one neat little study. But as a general background to everything, my work was looking at optimizing physical activity after gestational diabetes, so it kind of came to why. Well, women who have gestational diabetes, which is quite common, can't remember the statistic off the top of my head because I haven't looked at this in many years now, but it's quite a high percentage of women who have gestational diabetes in pregnancy, and the implications of that is then they have this 10 times increased risk of type 2 diabetes. That figure is relatively recent, although it has changed over time. But that specifically was a figure that came out of the Leicester Diabetes Research Centre, I think, in 2021. So when I started my PhD, it was like the big, 10 times increased risk, what are we going to do about it? And actually the James Lind Alliance did this diabetes and pregnancy priority setting partnership. And one of the main things they've said is important to start looking into is reducing this risk of type 2 diabetes after gestational diabetes, specifically looking at physical activity, and I'll come on to that. But it is in NICE guidelines to speak to women who've had gestational diabetes and tell them about their risk and how to manage that risk, both during pregnancy, but also postpartum and postnatally as well. Whether that's happening, we'll kind of get into that. But the reason that that's really important is because being physically active and engaging in other things like dietary changes can reduce this risk of type 2 diabetes, even after gestational diabetes, by as much as 50%. So quite a significant number. But actually, what the literature is suggesting is that women tend to be less active after they've given birth, and generally there's a decline in physical activity at this time. And when I was doing my literature searching, it was seeing that there wasn't a big focus on physical activity, and I come from a sort of sports science background, so that really gauged my interest, which is why I decided to look into this and specifically looked at what could work to optimize physical activity engagement after gestational diabetes. And what I used was a multi-level approach, which is this one. So I used the sociological model as a theoretical framework throughout my PhD, throughout my thesis, as it was quite a useful tool actually. I did evaluate a few different tools to think about what could work best, and kind of with the help of the supervisory team, decided this was the way to go, and it will appear in some of the slides I'll show later on. So I just wanted to explain what this model is. Essentially, it takes into account that individual behavior doesn't just function sort of its own, and actually there's these other sort of bidirectional factors that encapsulate that person in the center and can influence individual behavior. So to give an example, things at that interpersonal level are things like motivation, awareness of risk or education. At that social level, things like partner, family, or those social contacts that could be around women who have gestational diabetes. At the organizational level, it's things like childcare, but could be things like work, healthcare settings, those kinds of organizations. Some people also talk about environment within that. There are different versions of this model, but this is the one that we kind of stuck with. Community is things like, could be either physical places or, how to explain it, like social connections that people have developed. So it could be a physical space like a family hub or community center, but it could also be these support groups like new moms groups or other physical activity spaces that encourage this community space and community feel. And then finally, you've got this sort of policy cap around it, so things like NICE guidance, but even more applied could be local regulations, could be things within the National Diabetes Prevention Program, and just how the political landscape influences and aligns where resources are targeted, put it that way. So as an applied example, if you're someone who wants to go on a run, but the neighborhood that you live in is unsafe, you might not go on that run even if you're quite motivated to do so. So it's just an example where there could be a sort of wider or organizational environmental constraint impacting you being active, despite wanting to be active. So the whole premise of my thesis ended up focusing on those other levels, the social, organization, community, and policy levels, not because that interpersonal isn't important, but because it was quite saturated, and actually there wasn't so much of a target or focus on what are some of the other things we can look at to enable physical activity. So that model underpinned the work I did, which was this realist-inspired or realist approach. And I've given a little overview here, and I'm going to take you through each step. It looks nice and neat. It wasn't nice and neat. It's very iterative. It was very messy. but for the sake of presenting, trying to make it look prettier. But essentially, using the sociological model ended up being a scaffold, which helps give that basis into theories. And the whole idea of this realist approach is to end up with theories of what we think were working or were not working to develop some recommendations. So I'm going to kind of take you through each step, but as you see, there's these several rounds of refinement, which is again key in realist research, using different kinds of methods alongside it to generate some theories that we have a little bit of faith in, essentially. So this first step of developing these initial theories, step number one, step number one, was in the very beginning of my PhD. I started looking through the literature, reading some great literature, and worked with the PPI group. And I just wanted to take a second to talk about that a little bit, because it was really important for me. I started my PhD in February 2021, and at the time, and currently I've never been pregnant, never had gestational diabetes, and it was something that I thought was really important because I didn't think I could start talking about what was important and directing the research without having ever experienced it myself. And when I'm looking at some of the literature and support from my supervisory team, they were all in agreement with that, so I had a lot of support to establish this group. I actually did it through volunteering with Diabetes UK, which I was doing at the time. They had a support group virtually for women who had gestational diabetes. It's not ongoing anymore. It was actually a response to the pandemic and putting things online to create this supportive environment. So I was part of this group and so connected to some of the women there, and they were really interested in what I was going to do. And Diabetes UK allowed me to give them some posters and recruit for this group. So we established this group of women. I think it was around 10 in total, but it ebbed and flowed. If you think I started in 2021, I graduated last November 2024. This is a group of women who at the time were pregnant or just given birth. So a lot changes in those first 4 years when they have a young child. So it was very much a drop in and out as you can, and made it really flexible. But essentially they contributed to the recruitment ideas and strategies, mapping contacts, which I'll come on to, things like suggesting data collection approaches, looking at interview schedules, and then also at the very end, this sense of checking of the recommendations that I kind of developed alongside some of these women, but also different other stakeholders that were involved. That was that kind of first initial step, involving that advisory group and starting to think about what was important and what we need to look at, which then naturally led to reviews, systematic reviews, and ended up being. And so I did this first cycle of refinement by doing this very systematic search of literature. And I wanted to find out, like I say, I've published both of these now, but I wanted to first think about, well, what's actually been done. So that was the first systematic review, where I looked at any sort of physical activity intervention, not just RCTs, just anything that had been done, to think about what components were being used. Were people engaging women through community groups or not, healthcare settings? How were they trying to engage physical activity, and really looking at those intervention components, so the what could be working essentially and what was being done and how that was impacting physical activity. And then the next stage after I looked at that, I was sort of thinking, well, if that's what's been done, but what are women saying is helpful or maybe impacting their engagement? So I started looking at all the buyers and facilitators out there. And actually through doing that review, I realized there wasn't a whole lot on just physical activity. And that systematic review, I think, identified 2 of the 23 papers that were kind of physical activity geared, and one was in 2009. So like super out of date, and there just wasn't anything out there. So that then led to the next stage of the work, where I sort of figured, well, if there's not a lot of a physical activity deep dive, and I'm looking at physical activity, and this is asked sort of in the context of many other things while I extracted them from the analysis, I wanted to get that deep dive and actually speak to women specifically about physical activity. Recruitment was really tough. It was literally just a black pandemic. We were sort of shutting down, opening. I had the aim of using community groups, but then there's ethical implications because they were tied with numbers and I couldn't take a spot away from someone who needed it. And so actually about 9 months of trying, I had to totally flip how I was recruiting women, and ended up going through Sheffield Teaching Hospital, who sent out packs. I think we sent 400 packs out in total. I got 13 responses, and then 12 women completed the interview, which was pretty good. I guess as a summary, I've obviously put the tables up there as an extraction, but everyone was over the age of 30. As a little background and context, increasing maternal age does increase risk of gestational diabetes also. So 2/3 of the women are self-identified as white British. IMD, so IMD being that index of multiple deprivation, we use based on postcodes because we have this data, was quite evenly spread, which was actually quite as a relief, thinking like, okay, maybe we weren't just targeting one sort of group of people, it was people who lived all across Sheffield to help give us that idea of what was going on, but they were all sort of highly educated. Only 2 women hadn't gone to higher education institutions, and they were all in some form of employment. So while it's not the most diverse sample, and I do come onto this as limitations in my PhD, the literature also isn't quite diverse. So there is a huge gap here. I think there is a PhD student currently, Elysa, who's looking at, for example, South Asian women and sort of gestational diabetes or type 2 diabetes. So there is a big gap in terms of what conclusions we can make with some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, but also what's generally within the literature in this space. So I did also publish this, and like I said, I'll put the QR code at the end if anyone wants to read any of these papers. And then I did this final cycle of refinement where we worked again with that advisory group to think about, well, who have you had contact with over sort of your pregnancy and postpartum? And what we did was we pulled together this like mapping exercise about professionals that come in contact with, both from pregnancy, postpartum, and maybe any others that were relevant to sort of gestational diabetes and physical activity. We ended up speaking to 13 different professionals. As you can see, mainly were during that pregnancy phase, which is interesting because obviously there's recommendations to talk about postpartum physical activity and lifestyle during pregnancy, but what some women had mentioned in that previous phase was that that might not be the most appropriate time, and actually there is this gap postpartum. So I'm going to come on to that in some of the results that we present. And actually when we were recruiting the general practitioners and postpartum sort of healthcare professionals, there was a bit of a misunderstanding with maybe not being aware that they were responsible for this group of women because they'd already been discharged. They're meant to sort of go back to GP practices, and there did seem to be a bit of a transitional loss there for some reason, which I don't have the power about, but if anyone would like to fund or do any further research, let me know. This has also been published, and again, that link is on the QR code. So once we've kind of done all these steps, I then had a very messy collection of notes and all sorts of things. I came together in a room with my supervisors, maybe even up to 10 times over the course of a few months of going back and forth, looking at data from this stage and then that stage and bringing it back together, whiteboards, papers, meeting PhD students, putting everything on the paper, starting over again. I mean, it was very back and forth to end up with these final theories. And we had 10 final theories. When I talked about the sociological model in the beginning, what ended up, it didn't sit right to have a theory under each section of the model, because in reality, and I'll give you an example of one theory as a breakdown. Each of these theories, like for example, saying women need to feel empowered to engage with physical activity, they have multiple targets. So even within that theory, what we then did was break down how you would address that within different levels of the model. So I'm just going to briefly read out some of these theories. They might seem pretty straightforward, but it's not been said before. So obviously there was still a need to look at it. So theory number 2, that weight loss and weight management was motivating for physical activity, but that was quite variable. So for some women it is helpful, for some women it wasn't. Support from partners, significant others, or wider family can enable physical activity. Professionals and other practitioners need to provide personalized support for physical activity. Co-location of affordable and beneficial childcare and physical activity spaces is essential. And that was a really big one that sort of came up, that childcare, that need for childcare. Women who feel guilty taking time to engage in physical activity may be less inclined to do so. The location, cost, and access to physical activity overshadows and constrains the desire to engage in physical activity. Poor continuity of care for women after gestational diabetes reduces contact points and opportunities for physical activity conversations. So that was where we got a lot of that out of the interviews with professionals as well as speaking to our women. And then connecting women after gestational diabetes can reinforce and facilitate collective physical activity. And finally, physical activity resources within communities and locally are valuable assets that should be mobilized to support activity. I wanted to give you a breakdown of a detailed example of sort of how we ended up with what we ended up with these theories. So, for example, with the weight loss or management being a motivating factor, the first step in this realist approach, and you can present in different ways, but we used if then because statements. So if interventions and services have a weight focus, so within this group of women, then these physical activity outcomes will be variable. And that's because women are differently motivated by weight-based outcomes. So while a lot of the NICE guidelines, for example, say to speak to women about lifestyle changes, that always kind of gets conflated with just weight or diet, and there's this neglect of physical activity. And actually, what we need to be recommending, what we need to be stating explicitly and separately within guidance documents and policy and working with healthcare professionals is actually talking about physical activity in and of its own right, and the positives that you get from physical activity outside of some of these other factors that are maybe less controllable too, because I would argue weight's an outcome, not a behavior. So we then looked about where this would matter more or less. So for example, whether women are motivated by physical activity or weight loss might matter less if women were finding that quite helpful for motivating physical activity. So women who were motivated by weight loss, then maybe it wouldn't matter whether they were not talked about physical activity separately because they would still engage with physical activity in order to lose weight. But in terms of where that would have more of an impact, more negative impact of physical activity is where women would find that demotivating, or whether some women would start off really motivated, then their weight would stagnate, or they would stop losing weight, or they might gain weight, so then they'd lose that motivation to continue being active. And some women, we saw actually in some of the literature, some women we spoke to might feel this extra pressure to bounce back postpartum, and that was actually quite negative mentally for them as well, but also for physical activity because it would destabilize the want for physical activity, and same for specifically women who maybe had higher body fat percentages and felt some stigma there from healthcare professionals. So that's where it would matter more or less, and this is where the model then came in and like, okay, well, what do we do about it? How do we target this? So that was where it was important to talk about, in this case, emphasizing that physical activity for longevity, health, family health being sort of aligning with their own goals. And things like, again, in that interpersonal level, while it's still important, addressing those beliefs around physical activity, but specifically also educating or engaging in CPD with professionals that would be working with women, so targeting at that sort of social and organizational level, to also strive to change this and lead to some impact. So I just wanted to give you that one example of theory. My thesis should be available on SHU in the next couple of months. I had an embargo on it. This work is all under review. Currently, it's been under review for 8 months. I still haven't had the first round yet. It's a bit slow, but hopefully it'll come out at some point. But essentially, once I had those theories, I then went back to my advisory group and also spoke to other sort of stakeholders like Active Pregnancy Foundation, Diabetes UK, other healthcare professionals to sense check some of the recommendations and help develop these recommendations, which I'm not going to take you through in full because it is just words on a page at this point, but essentially the take home from this, because I think I'm also conscious of time, is that we have recommendations at the social level, organization level, community level, and policy. At the social level, it was more about working or supporting healthcare professionals and other professionals to support women in this sort of inclusive, non-stigmatizing way, focusing on physical activity. But also this idea that partner support and family influence is important, so trying to include or incorporate that within interventions in healthcare settings is important if it's possible, but obviously that's not always possible. At the organization level, it was again looking at like gyms or other facilities, exercise classes that could be supportive, so co-located childcare being a massive one, and if there was any crash available. Again, just including this isn't necessarily going to make all women be active now, but it's just something that would help a good majority of people that maybe aren't currently able to be active for whatever reason, right? It's the same with all of these. Like we could start including council-led initiatives for subsidizing costs, but it's not going to solve everyone's maybe wider issues if they can't put the heating on, how they're going to be active. So there's things we can do that would be really helpful and help a certain group of people, but it's not necessarily that each one of these is going to solve the whole problem in and of its own right. Community level, it was again things like, co-locating, but women's opportunities for women in child physical activity spaces. So I know at Sheffield Hatters at some point they tried to encourage parents to go for a walk, especially in the summer, while their kids were at a basketball session. So things like that, where we can incorporate and support environments for women to be active, but within their children's spaces if they're already there, rather than just sitting around. And at the policy level, there's a few things that we looked at. Some of this is actually maybe changed now, as obviously we've had a change of government since, and there's a whole different spending will be coming out. But things like improving continuity of care was a massive one. I think of everything here, we can look at that follow-up point and that transition of women once they've given birth back into their sort of standard GP practice and how we enable that support. I think it's really important. So that's probably the biggest take home from that policy level support. But like I said in the beginning, there's some considerations or limitations of some of this in terms of the sort of diverseness of the data available to date, and that it isn't necessarily very representative, and there does need to be a lot more to be done. And a lot of these theories are limited based on this available to date and the data that we could collect. So while the theories were our, say, final theories, they're not to say that they can't be changed, disputed, refined as more data is collected and as we understand more about sort of the topic and everything. So I'm just going to leave you with the summary figure of the recommendations and the QR code if anyone wants to read any of the work, but I think I don't have anything more to add to that. Any questions?
Great presentation. What did you enjoy the most about doing the work?
I'm going to go more philosophical and actually say that I took a good chunk of time actually reading a little bit of philosophy, and I think developing myself personally and understanding maybe different viewpoints and how I may not align with all viewpoints, but it doesn't necessarily make something wrong. And so I actually quite enjoyed seeing how I developed throughout the process.
Cool.
Go on. This might be a bit tricky, this question, hopefully not. Why did you choose a social ecological model rather than just a social model, for example?
Yeah, well, honestly, I could have chosen a variety of different models and it just would have impacted how we presented the results and the data that came out of it. It's not necessarily the only model that would have been helpful, but I was using it as a tool to make sense of sort of the work and give the work a bit more like grounding and scaffolding. I aligned with this model more in the sense that it made sense in the way that I think and perceive how everything works. So it just made it a lot easier to actually analyze the data and give meaning to it because I was the one doing that and generating that. But I did look into other models and even things like, never pronounce names, the Dell Whitehead model, which I considered a lot at the time, but then decided because I was looking at individual behaviors and because it just made sense to me that the way the current literature is being presented, was presented, is very much about individual motivation. So there's a paper that came out a couple of years ago, made my blood boil, but it was literally saying how these women have gestational diabetes, these women attended screening, therefore women are not motivated to attend screening and we need to address their motivation. And my biggest criticism of that paper, which maybe it's just me, was that you actually haven't seen how many were invited for screening. You just made a conclusion that women aren't motivated just based on this random statistic. But actually I've spoken to some women and I've looked at sort of some of the other work and I would argue that no, there's a system level issue here. And I just felt that using this model, it meant that I could look at and target some of those factors while still understanding there's that individual control and impact, but specifically give this platform for looking at some of these other layers and levels to individual behavior.
Thank you.
Did any of the women that you interviewed actually have really positive experiences? Picking up from what you're saying, I hear more negatives like it can improve, and obviously it can always improve.
Yeah.
But did some actually have positive experiences as well?
Yeah, actually it was quite mixed. I think probably as is the way in research, you tend to maybe get the really negative or the really positive viewpoints because they might be people that are more motivated to talk to you. And I did have both. I had some women who were like really positive about physical activity, but maybe still really negative about their experiences within either the healthcare setting. Bear in mind, these women sort of were being supported during the pandemic. So it was quite a unique time because some of them were being sent like glucose monitors, being told over the phone that they needed to lose weight when they're pregnant without being seen by a healthcare professional, and then being said, yeah, let's measure your glucose. Whereas actually, when it wasn't the pandemic, and I mean, I'm assuming now, but maybe needs to be looked into, women would have a proper session to be like, this is how you do it, here's a finger prick, this is what you measure. You get that support, which was lacking. So there is something underlying in this and that, and I'd set this out within the context section. My thesis is that a lot of this data was collected when, you know, it was an unprecedented time. There does need to be more work now, but whether everything's gone back to what it was isn't clear anyway either. So I think things have changed or changing, but I think there's still a lot of unknowns. But yeah, women were generally quite mixed, but because the aim was to look at what we could do to improve and what could work, a lot of it was about suggestions for like what could work better, because a lot of what was happening wasn't working.
I think one of the key things that I took away from this is also from personal experience is the segregation of like, this person's here to talk about this part of your pregnancy, this part of your pregnancy. There isn't that follow on.
Yeah.
And so like that's definitely something, whatever kind of pregnancy, and even if you are suffering something like depression, like what you could get, they argue that it's good to have different, rather than having one person, having different people see you, they can pick things up. But I would say that you don't build that personal relationship to talk. So I know that some people find it difficult, even if it's your GP practice speaking to a midwife. That is actually a different midwife every time for some people.
Yeah.
For some people it's the same midwife,
Yeah.
and that's when you build relationships and can share those kind of stories.
Yeah.
Does that also result in conflicting advice sometimes, where one professional can say one thing?
Yeah,
and
definitely.
another professional say, oh no, you're not ready to do that yet.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, so obviously I spoke to two different GPs, and the one GP was very much aware of like, oh, well, I'm based in this really unsafe neighborhood, so I can possibly recommend X, Y, Z to my patients. Yet the other GP was literally almost quote unquote, anyone can buy running shoes and just run to it in a private park run. So there was really varied extremes in terms of perceiving their patients and what they felt was important for support, and their own sort of experiences and biases on, you know, well, they're just lazy. You know, so I did see some stigma or stigmatizing language in some of the work, but then also saw the opposite. So yeah, you got both.
And the social element, there's also around a lot of people, you know, I've had friends that have had miscarriages, and actually people are scared to do physical activity because there's a link between it, and you know, there has been evidence as well around that. So that's another.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of, obviously we're specifically looking at physical activity postpartum, but there is something to say about what you've been told in pregnancy impacting, you know, what you're thinking afterwards. And obviously the Active Pregnancy Foundation does a lot of work about, you know, encouraging safe physical activity both during pregnancy and sort of postpartum and that transition and sort of what recommendations are. So it just seems that some professionals are aware of some of these guidelines and maybe are happy to encourage them, but a lot of the time there is this sort of unsureness about what to say, and especially postpartum where, I mean, in the UK, you don't really get support with pelvic floor health. It did come up in a 2024 Better Birth report, might be 2023, about this need to push and support pelvic floor health after birth, and that was in like a midwife targeted guideline. So that is still a big stepping stone to them being able to do physical activity comfortably. And actually, in the Women's International Health Week, there were some talks that the Active Pregnancy Foundation did organise, and one thing stuck with me that pelvic floor physiotherapist said was, just because something is common doesn't mean it's normal. Yeah, a lot of women are being told they have to accept it because it's common, but actually that's a big important stepping stone to anything sort of physical activity and lifelong physical activity. So.
I just wondered, you mentioned Shepherd Hatters.
Yeah.
Are there any lessons that could be applied in voluntary sports clubs?
Yes, whole can of worms on my thoughts on that. Just because I have a background in playing professional sport and I've been involved in a lot of sport and then have transitioned out of that, and obviously have a background more in physical activity and health. So I do really think it's it would be such a key place to support and target people, because I am a lover of sport with that bias, and I know for a lot of people it's a big turn off. But I understand why, because I don't think it's a very inclusive environment, and even without giving examples, but you know, most sports clubs, I think, say you had a child who had the excess weight might be inclusive for them. Say you know, we're a woman who has kids and has other priorities and has to miss a couple sessions, so I'm not dedicated enough. Like, everyone is kind of being held at this like elite standard of sort of expected how to behave in a sports club, but I actually think there should be a lot more flexibility and inclusion, but it almost goes against the culture of some elite sports. So I think it's really complex, and it's something I'm personally quite interested in, but I think that there's so much opportunity there, but I think there are some cultural and social barriers that would be impacting that for some clubs at the moment. There might be others that are really ready to start implementing things, but some that might need a bit more, change
It's
first.
time pressure on parents, isn't it, as well? Because from that perspective, we've had a lot of parents interested in playing in the adult session, but because their child is playing early, it's not practical for them to then go home, drop the child, and come back for the adult. So actually, if you want to make it work, you've got to put that session on at the same time. But because of facilities, for what you're doing, asking the 14-year-olds to train at 8 is a bit like, it doesn't work.
Yeah,
I think there's a big issue around facilities as well, because for outdoor team sports in particular, the facilities adjacent, there aren't childcare facilities anywhere near the pitch.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of
yeah. I think that's the thing, like with one of the recommendations being co-located childcare, obviously maybe in a gym space it might seem like an easier way than target it in other settings. I know that you always get the unique example of like, you know, someone who's brought kid to be on pitch side and kids watching while mum plays, and that can happen, but I think that that's like a rarity and isn't necessarily easy to do as much as it might be normalized. I think not everyone is able to do that.
I think it's more common in some sports than others.
Yeah.
Where there are, especially sports where mixed participation is more common.
Yeah, but I do think, especially with co-located childcare, as much as I'm recommending it's something that needs to be looked into or done and actually then evaluate it, because actually I think we've got a lot of research now, and yes, while there's always more to be done, I think actually we're at a point now that we need a bit of action, like we need to start implementing things and seeing if it helps and if it works. But there is something to talk about. Well, actually, is there organisation barriers for childcare? Is there like costs? How would you get someone involved who's maybe child safe or has those qualifications, or where would be a trusted service? And again, practical things like facilities. So I think that there could be really a good, like a really cool deep dive on that, and maybe a practical applied setting or evaluation of it within a small context, which I'm trying to get funding for, which hopefully maybe we will at some point. But I think there is more to look into for that. And like I said, it's not necessarily the be-all solution. It might not work.
Have you thought of approaching any governing bodies?
We did, well, so we tried to apply for a PhD sort of funding opportunity for it, but the project was a bit ambitious for that, so hopefully there will be more opportunities to look into that. I mean, I've just applied for the Early Career Research and Innovation Fellowship, so if I was to get that time, then I would both look at some of the work I'm currently doing, which is looking at these complications of analytics for children and young people. I'd also be looking into doing something and extending some of this work with some other funding outside of that, or maybe like an external fellowship, because I think there's so much more to be done in this. Like, it feels like here's a good starting point, that's theory-based, that we should start looking into. But like I said, I don't think this is like the final thing, and it's going to be like, yeah, okay, easy, just one, like, I don't know, little play care setting, and that's going to solve it for everyone, because it might help a lot of people, but again, if you context specific on it, it's even possible to do. So yeah, I think there is more to look into for that.
Any more questions? Or online, is there any question? There's not.
I'll just give you a personal example. So my wife went by me, we've got a 12-week-old Barnaby at home, and her second pregnancy developed gestational diabetes the second time. Very good care during, a lot better than when it was pandemic. Had all of the training about how to monitor blood glucose, went brilliant. Had Barney, everything's fine.
And it's over.
Yeah, been told, oh, you're not diabetic anymore. Off you go then, and that's literally a lot. So obviously, I've got a background in this. She's physically active. With, so all of the things that you say make it possible, we can make possible for her, but if you weren't, it's literally not that.
Yeah.
never
Yeah.
been talked about again.
That's why I
From
think that
there.
was one of the biggest things in terms of that wider context, that like continuity of care and transition is really like, it's not physical activity, but it is. Like, unless you get the basics right, how do you then scaffold onto the other stuff that's needed? And I think that was like a really big one.
It's the GP's bothered at every year blood test to check she hasn't developed type 2, but that's literally it in terms of the widest.
Let's fund sports scientists as an allied healthcare professional. I think that's. Do you want me to just stop sharing the screen? And...
Thank you. Can you stop the recording?
Yeah.
Go.